The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was when Kennedy faced off with Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. See, back in '59, Cuba's Revolutionary War made it a tiny communist country right near the U.S. shore. That same year, the U.S. made a deal with Turkey's leaders to put U.S. nukes in Turkey to fire at Russia if needed. Flash forward to October 1962 again. Soviet nukes are found in Cuba like ours in Turkey right near them. The U.S. Joint Chiefs told JFK this was a good occasion to get rid of Cuba's government with a big U.S. invasion. But JFK said no because those nukes were awfully frightening. If we struck Cuba, Russia might think attacking us would be the right thing. It could lead to nuclear war, and of all outcomes, that's the worst. So JFK said before invading, let's try something else first. So one night on TV, he announced the plan he'd made. He'd stop Soviet shipments to Cuba with a strict naval blockade. But Khrushchev of the Soviets said this was risking war. You can't just stop our ships, he said, the blockade will be ignored. And when the U.S. got this message the night of October 23, defense went up to DEFCON 2, the highest nuke alert in history. This meant the U.S. was just one step from launching nuclear weapons, and as the blockade began stopping boats, no one knew what would happen. But then a KGB agent named Foman in the States said, let's just try a peaceful trade before this.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
He said before invading, let's try something else first. So one night on TV, he announced the plan he'd made. he'd stop Soviet shipments to Cuba with a strict naval blockade. But Khrushchev of the Soviets said this was risking war. You can't just stop our ships, he said, the blockade will be ignored. And when the US got this message the night of October 23, defense went up to DEFCON 2, the highest nuke alert in history. This meant the US was just one step from launching nuclear weapons, and as the blockade began stopping boats, no one knew what would happen. But then a KGB agent named Fomin in the States said, let's just try a peaceful trade before this escalates. Fomin said if the US promised to leave Cuba alone, maybe then the Soviets could promise to take the defensive missiles home. Then Khrushchev tried a different deal to make a missile recall work. He said the US should leave Cuba be and take their nukes out of Turkey. So JFK agreed to never invade Cuba, and he secretly also agreed to take the nukes off Turkish land. That part was kept a secret, so Kennedy could still look tough, but the fact was that both leaders thought things had gone quite far enough. Kennedy died 63, Khrushchev lost power 64,